Welcome again, everyone, to another episode of Disruption Drives. I have a very special guest today, a Y Combinator funded entrepreneur working on a really important problem. So I want to welcome Anthony Trasatti, who's the founder and CEO of Ontra Mobility. Now, Anthony has a PhD and a deep research background from Georgia Tech in data-driven modeling of public transit systems. He leveraged that PhD and fabulous research background to lead a true engineering leap in one of the biggest problems of the day, and designing the future of public transport. As I mentioned, they're already Y Combinator funded, and they're already finding great traction with MARTA in Atlanta and the Washington, D.C. District Department of Transportation. Anthony, thank you for joining the show and love to have a discussion on public transport. But let me ask you first. Your background and research has been to improve the mission for demand responsive transit. In other words, align transport to actual rider demand and public transport in specific, though. What influenced your decision to pick this as a problem to solve? I mean, we all know that America tends to lag behind the rest of the world in public transport. Why is this such a big problem to solve, and how are you solving it?
Yeah, so when we started working on this problem, it was actually right before COVID. And, the state of public transit in the US is in many parts of the country, it had been declining decade over decade for, the last few. But obviously COVID was quite a shock to the system. And, we were quick to look at the trends in ridership during this period where, ridership dropped in many areas by 80, 90%. So then the question becomes, how do transit agencies make themselves more resilient to this shift in demand as well as, as transit ridership's recovering, what does that look like? And how do transit agencies regain that ridership and also, increase ridership from where they were pre-COVID? So when we're looking at this, we looked at it from a few different angles, but one of the most important things that we focused on was how do transit agencies add in on-demand transit as the first and last mile piece? And how does that potentially make them more resilient when they're more resilient, but also more scalable so that they can better serve existing riders and capture more riders that, weren't necessarily using transit as much?
Absolutely. I think I want to quickly maybe quote, if you know, you know, but Bogota's famous mayor, Bogota city in Colombia, but there's a mayor called Enrique Peñalosa who basically said, well, and to paraphrase, he said, well, a great city is not one where, the poor people drive cars, but where the rich people also use transit. And so, Anthony, well, first of all, congratulations on working on such an important problem. So tell us a bit, what is your core end goal? You work in a very complex industry. There's basically at the center of everything, sustainability, affordability, access. But when cities and agencies approach you, what are they most concerned about? Why are they hiring you? And going back to maybe Peñalosa's statement, are you looking for broad adoption of transit? Or are you looking to serve existing populations, just with better options? Or it's a mix of both? Where do you lie? What is your asymptotic curve take you?
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that because our quote, if you search us on Google, is transit for all. And it's really supposed to be that, making it so that transit is convenient and accessible and attractive for everyone. Um, Sometimes I use the word ubiquitous, trying to make it so that, especially in the metropolitan areas, you have transit that can get you, wherever you're going, there's a competitive transit option within the city. You don't want the situation that it's a 10-minute drive in an hour by transit. You want a much more competitive transit option.
Absolutely. Tell us a bit about a solution and your research, of course.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is it that you have a better algorithm, better data, a better way to scale, a better go-to-market? What is your value add to what everything else that's out there?
Yeah, so our actual solution, what that looks like, is a algorithm that basically leverages a travel demand model. And it leverages, it both looks at existing riders, but also potential riders. And when will a potential rider make the switch to transit or not? So when we're optimizing your transit network, we're optimizing both your fixed route network and your on-demand services. using the on-demand for that first last mile piece. So
How do you predict a potential driver rider? What is it? Because yes, and a current rider, first of all, I assume let's look at New York City as an example, the MTA. I don't even know if they know who is a specific rider. I'm assuming you could know that with the card. How do you define a potential rider?
Yeah, so we look at both the census data as well as the employment data. So you have the longitudinal employment data. So you can start with, where the person works, where the person lives, yeah, a synthesized population of that. And then also you have all the points of interest that are in the city. So places that they might go to either on their way to work, on their way home, or additional trips outside of, their commute, especially since COVID, you have more people working from home. So those trips might be less about commuting and more about other trips, going to the grocery store, going to make a trip to the doctors, etc. So one of the critical pieces becomes first calibrating a demand model to predict the current ridership of the system. And then that allows you to be able to extrapolate uh, beyond, who's currently using the system to people that might use the system. So what you're looking at is the travel time that it takes by car, in addition to how long it takes to park, what their parking cost is, their gas cost, and then comparing that to how long it takes to get there by public transit. What's the frequency or expected wait time, the distribution of the wait time, the time you're in the vehicle, the time you have to walk to get there, and taking all those things to predict a percentage chance that they're going to take transit or not.
And so tell me about, when you're seeing transit changing, of course, post-COVID. I'm assuming there are a few very, predictable patterns and why people use transit to begin with. Partly it's for, morning commutes to work. Could be trips to the grocery store, dropping kids off at school or picking them up again. And then, of course, visiting friends or, going out to for leisure activities. Are you seeing these changing post-COVID? Because, as you said, commutes are becoming less common, but at the same time, probably more in volume.
Yeah.
But what are you betting on? Or really, are you trying to build this at the same time? On the flip side of it, you can only build a transit as at the end of the day, a fixed infrastructure. And you've got the trade-off between coverage, speed, and frequency as well. So how is that getting modeled as well when an agency purchases you, works with you? How does that become the output?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we're betting on is that public transit can scale better than the alternatives. And, when we think about that, Uber and Lyft, one of the big studies that have been done about them is they're not necessarily helping congestion in cities. A lot of these Uber drivers, are making these, deadhead trips where they don't have a passenger in the car. So they're actually adding vehicle miles traveled to the road network. And so when you're thinking about how a public transit agency can solve this, if you're using the high frequency vehicles to go on the main corridors and then using the demand response service or this on-demand service just on the outside periphery to connect people to and from these train stations and bus hubs that are then getting people, on a high frequency, in an HOV lane on the bus or on the subway or on the train, then you can actually reduce the vehicle miles traveled overall and both help with congestion and increase the public transit usage.
That's a great point, Anthony. And I want to ask you something slightly philosophical because last week we saw this announced at least Waymo and Via were going to partner. But you mentioned a very, very profound point about rideshare fundamentally not really solving congestion in big cities. And, of course, public transit is sort of really meant to solve that problem. Let me ask you this question, right? Do you see, and let's say assuming both, transportation as an industry as a whole is only going to explode in the coming years, fundamentally will rideshare, individual car rides, and public transit, shared rides, always be in incentive-wise conflicts with each other? Are they not in perpetual conflict? And how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And
It may not be a right answer, but I'd love to hear your take as someone who's specifically modeling global transit.
yeah, so one of the things that we do different than some of the competitors is when we're modeling the fleet or when we're modeling the system, we're often modeling it as a dedicated fleet operated by the public transit agency or potentially a hybrid fleet where you're having most of the trips done by the public transit agency connecting these riders to and from the fixed route services, and then maybe offloading some of those to Uber or Lyft where it makes sense algorithmically to, this rider is going in a different direction than the other three, so we're going to take these three, put them in a dedicated vehicle, bring them to the train station, and have this other one served by an outside system. And one of the benefits of that is you can actually now do more ride sharing when you're serving the first last mile because you have common points of destinations. Uber Pool has had historically trouble because everyone has a different origin and destination often. But if you can get people to be going to and from the same points, then that actually makes it easier to do this ride share. And autonomous vehicles potentially have the ability to reduce the cost per trip and make it so that on-demand service makes even more sense for this first last mile piece. But one of the key goals on our end is making it so that they're optimizing the whole system jointly, as opposed to, a Uber or Lyft that's trying to maximize their own profit
Right.
and maybe maximize the distance that they're
And
traveling for this
that may
ride
be your
service.
that sorry, that may actually be your biggest value add. You're one of the few people who's looking at it holistically, the entire system, which of course the transport agency is a sort of core fulcrum for it because every other player is maximizing their own bit, either for profit or for market share and so on, versus you're looking at it holistically and saying, well, here's where you want to put each of those cars to ensure that the most people are riding them. And you brought up an interesting point about autonomous vehicles. And I do want to challenge you a little bit on that and want to debate you. You saw that as autonomous vehicles fundamentally as potentially increasing affordability, reducing costs of travel. Tell us about that a little bit. How do you think autonomous transport, and I'm including rideshare and public transport, buses, shuttles, own cars, how will that affect your mission? What types? And yeah, I want to follow up a little bit, but would love your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I think it will have a similar pattern to Uber, where it actually, makes it so that, you know, mobility is more accessible in a lot more areas. And especially if it's at a lower cost than an Uber ride, then more and more people will want to use these rideshare services, but it also will further add to the congestion issue. So then if you can actually, instead leverage these for first last mile trips and then get people to a point that then they can take a high frequency vehicle and, go in a HOV lane or go in a subway and actually speed past all the traffic on the highway, then you can actually offer a better quality service at at your same $2.50 fare. And so it potentially creates a further opportunity for the public transit to actually better compete with the alternative ride sharing door-to-door services.
Fair enough. Let me ask you again from your perspective, right? You mentioned one of the assumptions, of course, is that autonomous vehicle service becomes cheaper than other service.
Yeah.
That's a big if at this point because
Yeah.
it's a computer on it's a it's a supercomputer, the most sophisticated machine ever built, more than any rocket ever built on a road. What is the pathway to that even happening? Are we 10 years out? Are we already there? Uh, what's because I mean that and then yes, then you argue if your transport becomes so vastly affordable, then yes, everything you're saying absolutely works out, right? It's the fact that there's going to be easy to put in cars out there, but that's still a 1 ton hunk of metal with a computer writing, with a very, very superior computer driving it.
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing, there's obviously the chance that, if you really get to that point that the computer is so much better at driving, that maybe you can charge a premium for that service over a traditional Uber or Lyft. But I think, you know, Moore's law is potentially going to make it so that, over time, that piece of it becomes more cheaper and cheaper. Um, Obviously, we're seeing lately that GPU prices are increasing, and that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
But I think there's also the argument if it actually is more expensive, then people won't actually make the switch to autonomous vehicles
Right.
over the existing. I have driven, I drove in a Waymo to try it out when I was in San Francisco doing Y Combinator last year, and definitely was impressed with where they're at right now, and definitely see it as, obviously there are political hurdles, across the nation in order to make this more widespread. But I definitely see that we are potentially close, or at least Waymo is very close to making this a real possibility and obviously they're going to be using it in the public transit space in
Absolutely, absolutely. But let
soon.
me ask you a different look. We saw the iPhone. The iPhone unlocked. The iPhone was a more expensive though phone than any phone that came before it, fundamentally. But it unlocked this whole ecosystem of data capture, an entire market of, the App Store and so on. And in fact, I would argue that that was really the leap that the iPhone made. The iPhone created a marketplace that had never existed before. Um, the phone itself was, just gravy, if you may.
Hmm.
How do you see with what types of data capture and algorithmic changes excite you about a computer on wheels? And you're the data, you're the you're working in this space and you have a PhD in this topic, but let me just throw it out there.
Yeah. From an algorithmic perspective of designing the network, I would say it's more parameter changes actually for how you capture an autonomous vehicle versus a non-autonomous vehicle for doing the network design piece. But obviously there are some different changes on the operational planning side and my co-founder is the expert in the part of dispatching algorithms for, a rideshare system like this. So he might have more thoughts on that. But the key things to think about are, does it affect travel times? Does it affect how long the vehicle might be willing to wait or how long it makes sense to wait, depending on what the cost is? And also, where you can relocate and what the brakes are and if you have EVs when the charging time is for these autonomous vehicles.
Absolutely. Well, Anthony, that's sort of all we have time for today, but I think with so many things working in the tailwinds in the industry and the problems you're solving, you're in an absolutely fabulous spot. So just wanted to, maybe wrap up right now, but wanted to tell everyone who's listening, right? Ontra Mobility, one of the most exciting startups working on really one of the biggest problems of our time. Definitely follow them and see what they're doing at ontramobility.com, ontramobility.com. Anthony is one of the, hopefully this is just the start. In fact, I'm sure it's just the start. They're Y Combinator funded. Great bet by Y Combinator, of course, and solving one of the one of the problems, the societal problems of not just the United States, but the entire world. As increased urbanization takes hold, this is one of the most important problems to solve. Transport enables all. When you get people to work, economies grow, economies flourish. There's enough research to show that, the better the transport system, the better the city. And with that, I wanted to thank you, Anthony, for first of all working on this absolutely awesome problem, but then coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Harry.